I've noticed that there's a huge failure in game criticism to not take context into account when attempting to review something. For example, I have a script for an unpublished Halo style series Synopsis where I ended up saying that I didn't understand what the game was going for in terms of its gameplay. In my opinion, it was too slow to be a run and gun, but not precise enough to be a real test of shooting skill. Now, in retrospect, I'm glad I never went through with that video because Halo, for its time, truly was revolutionary. In fact, the answer to my puzzlement in that script of what is Halo trying to be is that Halo was trying to be a first-person shooter that made up for the obvious deficiencies in console controls at the time. Now, I am a fan of first-person shooters, but I have far less of them under my belt than I do RPGs. I didn't truly get into the genre until about 2010 after I graduated high school, and most of the first-person shooter games I'd played in the intervening years had been on PC. So when I attempted to play Halo on the Master Chief Collection, it obviously felt quite sluggish and imprecise by comparison. But that's the problem. I was comparing it subconsciously to games like the original Doom, which I'd played all the way through for the first time just a couple years prior. It's still fantastic, by the way. And games like the original Half-Life, which I still hold as one of the best in the genre. It wasn't until a few months after writing the script that I picked up the Killzone HD trilogy and realized the error of my ways. The controls on the original Killzone are absolutely awful. I legitimately had trouble aiming at approaching enemies, let alone aiming precisely enough to score a headshot. I then tried out a few other first-person shooters from the time period and found this to be a common issue. But it was not an issue I had while playing Halo. It turns out that the slow movement speed works hand in hand with a liberal aiming window to create an experience that was far less frustrating than the norm at the time. I was hitting more shots than I was missing, and that alone put it well above the quality of its competition. I do still struggle to find enjoyment in the first Halo for a number of other reasons, and I still wouldn't give it a glowing review. But I do feel that my unpublished critique was a failure because I lacked the context of all that came before and even some of what came after. By replaying some old console shooters and putting myself in the shoes of gamers at the time, I was more able to accurately assess the merits of Halo and understand why it had been so highly praised when it was first released. This is why I now attempt to always back up my opinions with evidence from other titles that came out around the same time using similar technology, as I did in my Chrono Trigger review. Some of you may be wondering what this has to do with Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game that is widely infamous for dumbing down the RPG genre to a massive degree, and by extension insulting the intelligence of gamers in the United States. Much like myself with the first Halo, simply dismissing this game as insulting is missing a lot of context. Mystic Quest was, and always has been, marketed as an RPG for newcomers, and more specifically, given the perceived demographic of video game players at the time, young boys. To tear down the game for succeeding at its intended goal feels a bit antithetical to me. This is not to contradict the obvious points. Reviews are subjective opinions boiled in bias, and those who have lambasted Final Fantasy Mystic Quest because they don't enjoy it are absolutely entitled to their opinion. But Mystic Quest is far more fascinating to dive into when you understand its gameplay intent and its history. Or you could just skip to the review section if you're some kind of heathen. Timestamps in the description. When Final Fantasy IV was released in the US, known as Final Fantasy II at the time, it was considered a financial disappointment by Square, selling only 250,000 copies in the US versus the 1.3 million it had sold in Japan. This was even after Square had made significant changes to the game's difficulty in an attempt to make it more palatable to those whom were unfamiliar with the genre. But despite this sales failure, Square was still confident that RPGs could also be big in the West, and that interest just needed to be cultivated properly. They needed a title that could bridge the gap between adventure games like The Legend of Zelda and role-playing games like Final Fantasy IV, a sort of stepping stone that could give players a taste of what they were missing, so that they come back for more with more advanced titles. And so the concept of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was born. It was decided that the game would be designed by the same team that had just wrapped up development of Saga 3, also known as Final Fantasy Legend 3. And hey look, I even got a picture of the right guy this time. Seriously though, thanks to all of you who pointed out that mistake in my Final Fantasy Legends video. I am so sorry, it's greatly appreciated. Square did everything they could to make their investment pay off for the long term by not only selling the game for $39.99 at a point in time when games are closer to $50 on average, but also shipping the game with a mail-in coupon that would give the players a free strategy guide to get them through the game. Square covered all their bases and hoped for the best, that this truly would be the game that would convince US players that RPGs were a genre worth experiencing and taking seriously. And finally, October 5th, 1992, the date of Final Fantasy Mystic Quest's original US release. and hardly anyone bought it, at least comparatively so. While I haven't been able to find concrete sales figures, it seems to have sold less copies in the US than even Final Fantasy IV had. Mystic Quest was later released in Japan with the unfortunate, now infamous title Final Fantasy USA Mystic Quest, further digging a thorn in the side of sensitive American players. But I have some knowledge that may just soothe that wound by comparison. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was the first and only Final Fantasy game that PAL territories even had access to until Final Fantasy VII launched 5 years later. Though there the game was simply titled Mystic Quest Legend, which is not to be confused with the Game Boy game Mystic Quest that Square launched the same year, which was actually just Final Fantasy Adventure, rebranded a second time from its original title Seiken Densetsu. Yeah, Square's always been bad at naming things. Now there's this theory surrounding Final Fantasy Mystic Quest that critics hated it, but in reality, despite its low sales, that's not at all true. Of course, Metacritic wasn't a thing back then, but the site Defunct Games has since gone back with their review crew segment to make an aggregate score based upon reviews at the time. And Mystic Quest got a 73 out of 100, which would fall on the high end of Metacritic's current mixed or average Metacritic rating, only missing mostly positive by 2 points. Final Fantasy IV, which released the year prior, has an aggregate score of 85 out of 100, clearly higher than Mystic Quest's, but not by as much as you would think given Mystic Quest's reputation. Now, I don't hold much stock in Metacritic scores or review sites given the absolutely unproductive work environment they're stuck in, one that I had a small taste of a number of years ago, so I know firsthand how harmful it can be to actual critique. In fact, if you want a video that basically mirrors my opinion on the topic, check out my buddy EmceeProphIt's video, Why Does Modern Game Journalism Suck? Link in the description. He's very informative and very funny. Very much worth the time if you aren't already a fan. But even with my distaste for mainstream game criticism, if you put these scores side by side, they give us a clean reference point for what the general consensus was at the time of Mystic Quest's release. And that consensus actually seems to be quite benign. So where did the actual vitriol towards Final Fantasy Mystic Quest come from? Well, a lot of fans like to complain that they got this game instead of Final Fantasy V, and I could see how that would have been a hard pill to swallow at the time if you were aware of this, but I'm fairly certain that most players had no clue. A lot of fans didn't even know how many Final Fantasy games they'd missed until the numbering suddenly skipped from 3 to 7. So that kind of feels like retroactive history to me. There's only a brief 2-year period between the revelation that Square denied fans access to Final Fantasy V and it being released alongside Final Fantasy VI for the original PlayStation as part of Final Fantasy Anthology, so I guess for that fleeting moment in history, players would realize they were duped and maybe connect the dots back to Mystic Quest? And I'm sure someone somewhere can point to an article from 1992 briefly showing off Final Fantasy V to prove me wrong, or someone will say they had friends around the time period who imported games so they were in the know about the Final Fantasy faux pas well before Final Fantasy VII came out. But I can assure you that the majority of players in the United States at the time had absolutely no idea, which makes this rage against Mystic Quest for that particular reason kind of idiotic. The creation of one game is not the reason we didn't get the other. Personally, I don't think this rumor really started gaining traction until 2010, when Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was launched for the Wii Virtual Console, at which point the game was re-reviewed by many professionals, with less favorable scores than the game had received at its launch. I don't think it helped that 2010 was also in the midst of drastic changes in the game industry and internal changes at Square. Final Fantasy XIII had released a critical acclaim but fan backlash, and the video game market was in the midst of a JRPG drought, with Western developed games like Oblivion and Mass Effect quickly taking over the spotlight. A lot of fans of Final Fantasy felt the series' quality was declining, and having Final Fantasy Mystic Quest re-release could have been a bit of vindication. Oh look, Square isn't just screwing up now, they've always made terrible decisions. But this is all of course just my speculation based upon the evidence I have at hand. We may never really know the actual turning point for this game's infamy. But what we do know is that it has become a metaphorical punching bag, a meme, and most importantly of all, an example of Square's biggest missteps as a company, which is absolutely hilarious to me personally when compared to their actual missteps as a company. But what about the game itself? How do I feel it holds up while setting aside the game's reputation? Well, the truth is that the game's history is far more interesting than the game itself, and even though I could find very little information on the game's development, it's quite easy to see it was made on a budget due to its reuse of assets from Saga 3, but with the obvious and welcome addition of color. I think the game looks surprisingly good, all things considered. It has a cartoony look that's both appealing and fits with the tongue-in-cheek writing, well, what little there is anyway. I almost feel it was made purposefully to look like Western animation given the way games would often be marketed in the US at the time. The bright colors and and attention to detail give this game a level of charm despite its budget. There's little in the way of enemy animation, but that was pretty standard for the time, and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest improves on this standard by giving every enemy multiple poses depending on how much health they have remaining. This alone gives the visuals enough uniqueness to stand out amongst its brethren. The soundtrack is another often widely praised aspect of Mystic Quest, known for its upbeat and catchy melodies, a lot of which you will have heard throughout the course of this video. Square has always been known for having high production values in the genre, and Mystic Quest doesn't disappoint on that front given its time of release. But Square was also becoming known for their storytelling, which may make Mystic Quest a disappointment to a lot of fans. You are given the task of saving 4 elemental crystals and defeating the Dark King. It's pretty generic stuff and not at all compelling, but I think it's important to note that the story is intentionally thin so as not to get in the way of the gameplay. It feels to me like the goal was to make a self-insert power fantasy story, where the young player is whisked away to another world to be the hero themselves. So in that spirit, I renamed the main character Benjamin Stiles, which led to some pretty funny moments for me. Stiles is strong to confusion attacks. I can assure you all that Stiles most definitely is not. While the power fantasy intent is clear, it begs the question of whether or not this would have worked for me as a child. And it's hard to say as I didn't play this game for the first time until I was 18, but there is certainly a lot a child could relate to in the story. There's a character named Tristram who constantly refers to the player as kid, which is met with the stereotypical childlike rebuttal you would expect. Hey, don't call me kid, the name's Stiles! There's a line early on about how the character's allowance is 2 gold pieces a month, but by the end of the game you'll have more money than you have things to spend it on. You also spend a lot of the game being mentored by those older and stronger than you, only to finally towards the end of the game begin to outshine those whom you are traveling with, both in terms of your arsenal and your damage output. It's attention to details like these that I've come to appreciate over the years as a critic. The Mystic Quest has quite a few of them, but don't take this as a reassurance that the story is good or interesting overall. Far from it. But in the interest of fairness and attempting to nail down the game's intentions versus execution, I think it was very important to point out the aspects that do work to fulfill that goal. Of course, very little of this matters if the game itself isn't fun to play. I want to start this section by saying that there is a difference between difficulty and complexity, and Mystic Quest is not at all complex. It streamlines almost all of its systems so that the player never has to stop their forward momentum. Equipment upgrades are sequential and automatically equipped. The life spell doesn't simply revive players but also heals them to full HP whether they are alive or dead. Your secondary party members are controlled by the AI, at least by default until you change it in the menu. There is no denying that in these ways, the game is simple, but you'll often hear players say that Mystic Quest offers no strategy, which I disagree with. Now, it doesn't offer much strategy, but it is there, at least at the most basic and fundamental of levels. I would purposefully attack enemies I knew would do more damage to me or would hit me with a dangerous status effect, which would potentially teach new RPG players that prioritizing targets is important. I knew that the main character would do less damage than his partner for the majority of the game, so I'd have him attack one enemy twice while I purposefully targeted the other 2 with the guest character to take out enemies in as few turns as possible. This teaches players to maximize efficiency. The ability to change weapons on the fly and the fact that many enemies have specific weapon or elemental weaknesses meant that I often chose my targets based upon those aspects as well, and there was often a logic to these weaknesses that even young players will be able to grasp. Of course trees would be weak to axes, because you can cut down trees outside a battle with them as well. Arrows in the wind spell are good for taking down flying enemies? Well, I guess that makes perfect sense too. I'd have trouble flying if the wind was blowing me off course. Oh, but that would make them strong against quake attacks because they're above the ground. I've got to be careful with that. Yes, of course this is all incredibly basic to an adult. As a 26-year-old man, I was rarely blown away by these tactical opportunities, but for a child, this could lead them to truly experimenting with their multiple options, and this is all part of the game's simplicity. But players often say that this game is not difficult, which raises the question, not difficult in comparison to what? I'm guessing they mean the mainline series, which given its time of release would be arguably true. Final Fantasy IV is certainly more complex, even in its initial easy type version that America got. But I died less in that title, even on my original playthrough, than I did in my most recent playthrough of Mystic Quest. Thanks to the many instant death attacks enemies have access to, as well as status effects like paralysis and confusion being a death sentence, my party was quickly dispatched many a time. It's less that the game isn't difficult, and more that players will never feel that difficulty because of its many safety nets. setbacks. In my experience, difficulty in turn-based JRPGs is generally measured in a loss of progress and time. If a boss is too hard, you're sent back to a previous save, and if you still can't beat them after a few attempts, a player will usually resign themselves to grinding until they're capable of overcoming that obstacle. But Mystic Quest isn't built around fail states or lost progress. The biggest contributing factor to this is the 1-2 punch of being able to save anywhere and the ability to retry battles immediately after death. I'm of the opinion that the game should have chosen one option or the other. If you could save anywhere, you'd be less likely to lose progress, but unless the player was saving after every single battle, there would at least be minor setbacks. On the other hand, if the game only allowed you to save on the world map but you were able to retry battles you failed, the game wouldn't be a test of immediate skill, but it would be a test of resource management. You could retry any battle, but if you hadn't been keeping your party properly healed between fights, paying attention to their condition and their abilities, then you could have the slim possibility of being caught in a fight you couldn't win because of your carelessness, which would force a reset back to the beginning of a dungeon. While I like the idea of the second system more overall, for this game's stated goal of being a beginner-friendly RPG, I think that saving anywhere would have been a better option. In a similar way to how people say there's no difficulty in this title, I've also seen a lot of reviews that state that because the world map doesn't allow you to walk around freely, that the game has no exploration, which is completely false. Exploration in Mystic Quest, like in many other RPGs, comes from the dungeons themselves, and this is where I make arguably the most blasphemic statement I've ever put into a video. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest has better dungeon design than a lot of the games in the mainline Final Fantasy series. At the very least, I can say Mystic Quest has more interactivity than every game in the main series. And I really shouldn't be all that surprised by that, since I had the same compliment about Final Fantasy Legend 3, but here it's kicked up to 11. The desire to pull in adventure game players to the RPG genre meant that dungeon design was tooled to be more like Legend of Zelda, with the game giving you many tools and items that help you progress through each area. You can use your claw to climb up walls, you can use your sword to press switches, bombs blow up weak walls and clear obstacles. On top of that, there are environmental puzzles which, while simple, still work to keep exploration feeling fresh and interesting. And the game incentivizes freedom of choice in its exploration in a wonderful way, namely in how it telegraphs the usefulness of its treasure chests. Mystic Quest has two types of treasure chests: the generic brown, which only contain expendable items such as potions, bombs, or ammunition for your teammates, while the red treasure chests contain unique items, whether they be equipment upgrades or a teleportation crest. If you decide you're stocked up well enough on items, there's no real need to go after the brown chest that's guarded by a bunch of enemies. If later on in the dungeon you find yourself running low on items, you can backtrack to that brown chest because this game has no random battles. While this may not work in every RPG, as you don't want to discourage players from searching for items, it does flow very well in this title where the focus is on keeping things moving to hold the player's attention. I wish I could say the same thing about the battlefields. While the majority simply give you a bonus of experience points or gold, there are 4 battlefields that hide important items such as magic spells and equipment, and there's no way of knowing what you will get until you defeat all the enemies on each battlefield, which compelled me to fight them all for fear of missing out on something useful. Each battlefield has 10 encounters on it, and there are 20 of them. That's 200 battles alone, not counting those you'll run into throughout each dungeon. It was during these battlefield runs more than any other moment that I did feel my attention slipping, especially in the moments where there were 2 battlefields side by side. But it's important to note that these are technically optional, and the game can still be completed without the items hidden behind them, which flows with the general mentality of RPGs, that if you work hard, you'll be rewarded, which once again ties back into the beginner RPG design philosophy. You could definitely make the argument that I'm simply reaching for ideas that aren't there and accomplishments that weren't intended, but accidental or not, there were a lot of things about Mystic Quest that stuck out to me as I was playing that really worked well together. I can't in good conscience call this game a failure when the only actually bad thing anyone can say about it is that it's too easy. Well, outside of the story, you're not even going to hear me defending that much, but the worst thing I can say while striving for that oh so lauded goal of objectivity is that this game is perfectly competent, but underwhelming to me personally as a veteran of the genre. If you're a longtime RPG fan, you'll likely not enjoy Mystic Quest, but the truth is, the game isn't for you, and it was never meant to be for you. Your enjoyment of the game doesn't matter, just as my enjoyment of the game doesn't matter. We are not the target audience. This is not a game like Super Mario Bros. That's supposed to be accessible to new players and veterans alike. It is strictly meant for newcomers. You wouldn't judge Reader Rabbit as a bad game because it's too simple for adults, would you? The only way to truly know if Mystic Quest is successful beyond theoretical discussion is to plop an RPG first-timer down in front of it, preferably a 5-year-old male who has a good enough grasp on reading to struggle through the horrible script, and see if the game holds his attention and makes him want to jump into other games in the genre. But I must admit that even if Mystic Quest does properly fulfill its intended role, that doesn't mean that there aren't better games to play that can fulfill the same purpose. If you want a beginner-friendly RPG, I hear Super Mario RPG is a great start, which makes sense given that one of the most influential creators of Mystic Quest went on to make that title as well. Bet you didn't know that. On a side note, how have I never played this game? If you're an experienced RPG player like myself that's intrigued by the interactive dungeon design but wants more compelling combat and story, then play Golden Sun or Lufia 2. I haven't beaten these either. What is wrong with me? And if you want to play Final Fantasy, well, you have just a few other options. If you are a die-hard Final Fantasy fan that's curious enough about Mystic Quest to try the game out for yourself despite its reputation, and chances are that if you're watching this particular video, you are, then I can assure you that this game isn't nearly as bad as others would have you believe. That said, I've now beaten this game 3 times in my life, and I'll be perfectly content never playing it again. So, this isn't Kingdom Hearts. Yeah, that video is still in the works. Turns out that attempting to cover 10 games in one video takes a little bit of time. I'm trying really hard to keep a schedule though, so it was more important to me that I came back as close to February as possible than that I come back with Kingdom Hearts specifically. So I hope this addition to Stiles series Synopsis of Final Fantasy holds you all over. We've got a lot of videos coming down the pipeline, so stay tuned for more. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell button, blah, blah, blah. YouTube, fix yourself. All right, thanks again, everybody. See you soon. There's a character named Tristan who constantly refers to the player as Kid, which is met with several stereotypical childlike rebuttals such as, "Don't call me Kid, my name's Nathan." Oh shit.